Hello, fourth year students. Today we are going to talk about the approaches to and trends of language testing. Before we start with explaining in detail the approaches that were followed and are followed in the past and are followed now in language testing, you need to know an important fact about the teaching and testing relationship. Of course, we know that teaching and testing, they are closely related processes. That the way of teaching is, of course, it is going to affect the way that we test our students. The materials that we are teaching as teachers to our students are going to be included also in the testing form. And as the approach that we are following in teaching is going to be represented in the techniques, in certain techniques, in making or designing the suitable test for them. So teaching the forms of language test had been different according to the approaches that were followed in language teaching. And if we understand that language teaching itself, or the approaches that were used in teaching language, were also different. They were not, people were not following one approach in teaching language from the past until now. No. Different approaches were used in teaching language according to certain theories. So these approaches were made depending on the combination of psychological theories and linguistic theories. So that's why we need to understand the psychological basis and the linguistic basis for the approach that we use in teaching the language, because this will help us to understand the approach or the forms of tests that we are going to use to make language testing for our students. For example, the first approach that was used to test language is called the intuitive approach. Okay? The intuitive approach was the first method used in testing language. It was actually based on the first method that was used to teach the language. What was the first method or approach that was to teach language? It is called the grammar translation approach. If we want to understand what is a grammar and translation approach, we have to understand the bases on which this approach was designed. Okay, so the grammar translation approach was actually designed on a combination between what the faculty psychology, which was a theory of psychology at that time in the 20th and the 30th of the last century of the 20th century, okay, and this theory was combined with the theory in linguistics, which was called at that time traditional linguistics. Okay, so what is faculty psychology? Faculty psychology, or the psychologists who believed in this theory at that time, they believed that the mind of the human being is divided into faculties, sections. Okay, and each section is responsible for a certain process. So the psychologists at that time, they said that the mind of the human being is divided into 27 sections, like compassion, memory, perception, and so on. And each one of these 27 sections is responsible for a certain thing. Okay, so learning the language was the responsibility of which section? Of memory. Okay, so they believe, depending on this principle, the approach that was designed to teach the language at that time was the grammar translation approach. And we know that the grammar translation approach was based mainly on memorization. In order to learn language, you have to memorize. Memorize what? Memorize the list of vocabulary. Memorize grammatical structures and patterns of the sentences in language. Memorize meaning. Okay, so here this called, or this approach was based on, as we said, on faculty psychology and traditional linguistics. The way or the approach of grammar translation approach that was used in teaching the language was reflected in what? In language testing. So what do we have in language testing? Which approach? We call it the intuitive approach, or the intuitive type of testing, which we are going to explain it in detail later. Okay, here this is a summary for the major approaches that were followed or were adopted in language teaching and testing at the same time. So for instance, we have, as we said, within psychology we have faculty psychology. Within linguistics we have the traditional view of linguistics. So they were combined with each other and they produce for us in teaching grammar translation approach or grammar translation method. Okay, now what about testing? What is the method or the approach that was used in testing at that time? It was the intuitive approach or the intuitive method or the pre-scientific tests or the pre-scientific era. After the faculty psychology, we have a new psychological theory that appeared in the 50s of the previous century by F.B. Skinner, which was called behaviorism, that people learn things through what the stimulus response process. Okay, so this theory in psychology was combined with another theory we have in linguistics at that time, which was structuralism. So they produced for us a method of teaching, or an approach of teaching, which was called the audiolingual approach or the structural method. What about in testing? We have a type of test that was so commonly used at that time, which is called what? Discrete point test. Then, when behaviorism was rejected by people, by psychologists, by scientists, another psychological theory appeared, which is the cognitivism. Okay, this theory was combined with another theory that was popular or well known at that time, which is the transformational generative grammar or transformational generative linguistics that was devised by Noam Chomsky. So they both produce for us a method of teaching language, which is called the cognitive-based approach. What about the method that they were adopting in testing? It is called the integrative test or the integrative approach of testing language. And finally, okay, and this is the method that is used nowadays. It is called, in psychology, it is called the constructivist view that was combined with another theory in linguistics, which is what? The interactional view. So they produce for us, or they yielded for us, an approach in teaching language that is called the communicative approach. Okay, what about in testing? We have the functional communicative test. So this table presents for us a summary of the language, of the approaches or the trends that we have that have been devised to test language. And as you see, we said that they were depending on the method or the approach used in language teaching, and how these approaches were designed or made or constructed. They were made or constructed depending on a combination between psychological and linguistic theories. So if we start with the first approach used in language testing, it was called the essay translation approach. The essay translation approach was devised depending on the grammar translation approach in language teaching, And as you remember, we said that the grammar translation approach was originally constructed depending on the combination between the faculty psychology, the theory of psychology at that time, which was known the faculty psychology, and the theory in linguistics, which was known as traditional linguistics. So if you remember, we said that within faculty psychology, they divided the human mind into 27 sections, and they said that each section is responsible for a certain process. So they said that they believe that memory, that section of the mind was responsible for learning a language. That's why the main approach, the main method, the main technique that was followed in the grammar translation approach in language teaching and learning at that time was it was to make the students or the learners memorize lists of vocabulary, list of lexical items in the foreign language together with their meanings, as well as memorizing the patterns and structures of the sentences in the foreign language, and analyze them into patterns, and then to translate them into the foreign language or into the target language, or vice versa. So if we talk about now the essay translation approach, as you see in its background, it is called the pre-scientific or the intuitive age. No requirement for testing skills was required. The teachers were not required to learn to know anything about language testing, because the forms of test that were used at that time were specific. They were only asking students to analyze sentences according to their patterns, or give meaning of sentences, or translate certain passages. And mainly these passages were taken from the literary culture, from the literary content of the foreign language. Tests relied on subjective intuitive judgment of the teacher. So the scoring of these tests were relying mainly on the subjective judgment of teachers. Teachers were untrained in testing. The characteristics of the intuitive test: the tests were mainly subjective, as we said. They were asking what are the formats that were used at that time in testing, only asking students to label the parts of the sentence, analyze the parts of the patterns of sentences or the parts of the sentences, and memorizing list of language patterns and lexical items. Also, there was a writing test. Okay, asking students to write something or to summarize something in a form of précis questions, and these tests were requiring from these learners to have knowledge in meaning of words and the grammatical analysis of sentences. Tests were heavily loaded with literary content, you see, because most of the material that was used in teaching the language were actually adopted from the literary content of the foreign or the target language. The test structures were mostly open-ended items of reading comprehension, essay writing, dictation, précis, and translation. So these are the formats of the tests that were mainly used in language testing at that time, or according to the essay translation approach. Then this method, or the grammar translation approach, together with the essay in teaching, together with the essay translation approach in testing, were rejected. Okay, were rejected by experts, by educationalists, because they believe that languages are not learned by memorization. So another approach in language teaching was designed, which is called the audiolingual approach or the structural method. The audiolingual approach or the structural method was based on a new psychological theory which was the behaviorism. And behaviorism as we said, believed that, or F.B. Skinner, who devised this theory in psychology, believed that man learns just like the animals. They learn things by throughout the stimulus response. If you motivate man or human beings to learn something, they will learn it. Okay, so the same this approach, or this theory in psychology, was combined with the structural approach or structuralism as a theory of language, and they produce for us what they produce for us: the audiolingual method and the structural approach or the discrete point test in language testing. So the test at that time was called what kind of a test? It is called the discrete point test. What does it mean, discrete? Discrete, it means separate. So they are going to say that language, in fact, consists of components, consists of skills. What are the components of language? They are vocabulary, sounds. Okay, if we start with the smallest unit, they are the sounds. Sounds, they make what words, and words make sentences, and sentences should have meaning. So these are what the 4 components of language. At the same time, they said that language consists of skills, language learning. Okay, language learning is made of skills. What are they? Listening comprehension, speaking comprehension, reading, and writing. So what did they believe, or what did they do in teaching? They separate, okay, these components and these skills, which means that they teach them separately. They teach each component in language, or each skill in language by itself, far away from the other, believing that in order to be fluent in language, you have to learn each one of these skills or each components separately from the other ones. So it is called what? The discrete point test, or the psychometric test. Teachers were required to be trained in linguistics and measurement principles. So here, because here we are dealing with what? We are dealing with the things that make the language, the components of language. Okay, we have gone inside the language and analyzed the things that or the components and the skills that it is made up of with. This means, or this required from the teachers to be trained in what? In linguistics. Okay, so the teacher should not only know how to teach the language, but he should learn something about the structure of the language, and this is called what? Linguistics. And measurement principles. Measurement principles, why? Because he should be able to test his students. So here, teachers should have knowledge about language testing. Development of objective items is advocated. So the widely common form of test that was used at that time was what? The multiple choice test. And we know that multiple choice test is what? An objective form of test. And so here the tendency at that time was what? For designing objective items, objective types of tests, instead of the subjective tests that were commonly used in the previous approach, which was the grammar translation method. The approach is rooted in structuralism and behaviorism. Okay? So, what are the characteristics of the discrete point test? Language abilities are tested through subtests. Okay, what does it mean, subtest? That your test is going to consist of questions. Each question is going to examine or check the knowledge of your students in a certain component or a certain skill in language. Language skills are cut up into discrete point for testing. Okay, so you cannot test 2 skills at the same time. You cannot test reading and writing in the same question. No, each skill should be tested in a certain question. Each item is to measure, you see, 1 language point each time. Language is divided into sub-skills or skills and components. Discrete point test should be highly reliable and objective. So there should be no subjective judgment of the teacher, but they should be objective. And as we said, the widely common format of test that was used at that time was the multiple choice questions. So, but the problem that we have with these types of questions, or with the discrete point test, that they were what? Decontextualized, which means that they use sentences, okay, which are taken out of their context, which do not have a real context, so we call them decontextualized. The form is, as we say, multiple choice form. It was appropriate for diagnostic purposes. From the results that the teacher will get from the scores of his students or her students, he will be able to diagnose or to know the strengths and the weaknesses of his students. Quantifiable in terms of results. So we said that teachers who were following the discrete point test or the structural method, audiolingual method in language teaching and testing, they should have some knowledge about language, about testing, about measurement, about using statistics in order to analyze and interpret the results or the scores of their students. Okay. Then, during the 80s and the 90s, mainly the 80s of the previous century, the audiolingual method was what was rejected, because the scholars at that time, or the professionalists or the educationalists, they believed that language, in order to learn language effectively and to produce fluent learners, we should not divide it into its component. We should not deal with it as something that consists of separate components and separate skills. No, these skills and these components should be taught and learned together in order to produce a fluent learner and speaker and listener and reader and writer of the language. So, who devised or designed this approach for the first time? It was John W. Oler, is the originator. It integrates linguistic and extra-linguistic aspects. It is rooted in cognitivism and generativism. Okay, so you see here, this man, who's Oler, believed first of all that we should not, okay, or language ability should be indivisible or indivisible. What does it mean? That we should not divide language into components and skills and teach or learn them separately. It tends to test language skills integratively. What does it mean? That through one question, you can test more than one skill or one component of the language. Okay, they depended on what? They depended on, or this approach, the integrative approach, together with the pragmatic approach or the integrative approach in teaching, was based on what? Was based on the cognitivism and generativism, the generative or the transformational generative linguistics. So, what are the characteristics of the integrative test? They were integrative, and we said what we mean by the integrative. That integrative test through which you can test more than one, through one test item, one question, you can test more than one skill and one component. They assess language in meaningful, contextualized context. Okay, they provide real life situations, tend to integrate linguistic and extra-linguistic aspects, adopts a holistic global view of language teaching and testing, measure several levels and components, you see, measure several levels and components simultaneously, are concerned for communicative effect of discourse, assess the ability to use the first and the second language skills simultaneously. The forms of integrative tests were closed passages, dictation, oral interview, translation, and essay writing. Okay, but still, the main problem that was facing the integrative approach is that they were not proficiently or effectively contextualized. The sentences, the passages that were used in making the test were actually taken out of context. There was no real connection between the communicative competence of the student or the learner and his linguistic or her linguistic competence. So a new approach that was devised is called the pragmatic approach. The pragmatic tests were rooted in pragmatics and psycholinguistics, and we know what pragmatics means, that or is studying, or it is part of linguistics that studies how human beings use language in order to serve or in order to achieve certain functions in language. So we are here talking about what? About communicative, functional approach to language. So here we have what they devised, or they teach language forms that were used in certain situations to achieve certain functions. For instance, to make invitation, okay, to make suggestion, to apologize, to say sorry. So these are what? These are functions. The functions that we actually use language in our real life. So this is called pragmatics. Okay. So depending on this fact that human beings usually use language in their own life, in their real life, to serve certain functions, they have to be taught and tested the language in the same way. Okay, so they also accordingly they devised what is called the pragmatic, and then it was developed into the communicative approach in language. So what are the characteristics of the pragmatic test? The pragmatic test tend to test language in meaningful, natural context, because of course when you want to use language to do a certain function, communicative function, this should be in a context, a real context. So again, that you have to teach it within a real context, and at the same time you have to test it in a real context. In order to meet the naturalness criteria, learners are required to utilize normal contextual clues in the language, to comprehend linguistic and extra-linguistic context. Okay, because usually when we speak with each other, when we communicate with each other, we do not only use language. We use our facial expressions, we use our hand movements, body language. So the learners, they have to understand that if they want to understand or to use the language and to be tested in language, they should be able to understand both. Okay, the linguistic clues and the extra-linguistic clues. To map pragmatically linguistic features, you see, with extra-linguistic aspects, to join, to combine, to try to understand both of them in order to arrive at what the final meaning, in order to understand the final meaning that the speaker wants to say. Have learners employ their pragmatic expectancy grammar. What are the forms of pragmatic test? They were again using the closer procedure, okay, dictation, and here we have different forms of dictation: standard dictation, partial dictation, dictation with noise. Okay, here in dictation with noise, that the teacher, of course, is going to say sentences or read a passage and ask from his or her students to write what they heard. But here the environment is not going to be clear, it's not going to be quiet and calm, in order for the students to be able to listen and write what they heard. No, the environment is going to be just like similar just like to the natural environment in which people communicate with each other. Dictation composition approach, or forms of test: paragraph recognition, question answering, oral closed tasks, so interview, translation, and essay writing. Then the integrative approach, okay, were developed into the communicative approach or the performance, and nowadays they are called the performance test, okay, in which that they say that it is not enough to teach language to serve functions, okay. You have, in order to make your test of language more effective, you have to place the learners or the testees in real situations and observe them, and in order to evaluate their or assess their performance. So we have communicative test or performance test. Again, these performance tests or communicative tests, they focus on on social interaction and transaction. Interaction, you see that the learners should interact with each other. They should not do the test or take the test individually throughout the paper and pencil test the traditional way. It was emerged after the functional notional approach. You see here, so the language was not any longer taught and tested according to the function that language was used to achieve. No, language throughout the communicative and the performance approach or method in language testing believe that it should be tested in real situations. Okay, tend to assess the communicative competence of language together with the grammatical competence, the textual competence, the elocutionary competence, the sociolinguistic competence. So all the types of competence or the types of knowledge that students can use in a real life situation when he communicates with his friends, with his teachers, with his parents, or with his members of his family or her family. When you are put in a situation in which you are communicating with real people, you are going to use all these types of knowledge. You are going to use language, so this is what linguistic competence. You are going to use communicative competence. You are going to use language according to the situation in which you are in. This is communicative competence. You are going to use elocutionary competence. Your ability to understand the implied meaning. Okay, sometimes we say things and we mean something else. This is implied meaning. So we have to understand how people use language in order to express things that they are not actually saying. This is elocutionary competence. The sociolinguistic competence, you have to understand that when you communicate with people, you communicate differently according to the type of people you are communicating with, according to their gender, according to their positions, okay, according to your relationship with each other, with you and with each other. So this is sociolinguistic competence. So when you put your learner in a real situation, as a teacher, you have to test all these types of knowledges or competencies. So what are the characteristics of communicative tests? Communicative tests tend to measure language ability in meaningful communicative context. They are concerned with with real life communicative use of language. They focus on language use rather than language usage. And we said that there is a difference between use and usage. Use means that the actual use, the communicative use of language in life, in order to communicate, or in order for people to communicate with each other, they use the language. But if we talk about usage, by usage we mean the form of language. And here we are after not whether our students, they know how to make or construct a sentence in the present sense, for instance in the present tense correctly. No, we are after their correct use of the present tense in order to talk about real situations in life. They adopt the divisibility hypothesis. which means that they can, or teachers may resort to divide language into components and into skills, not for the purpose of teaching and testing them, but for the purpose of what? Improving the level of their students, because they believe that their students are weak in certain skill, or they need more support in a certain component of language. They need to devise new activities and concentrate or focus on this component or this skill in order to improve the performance of their students in them. Be culturally loaded, of course, when we are talking about the real use of language and the authentic use of language in real situations, of course, we are going to use it according to culture. Okay, here culture is very important. In order to be able to talk in language or speak in language and understand language proficiently and effectively, we have to know that language is totally connected to culture. So we need also to understand something about the culture of the language in order to be able to use it effectively and fluently. Use authentic language in test. Okay, and we mean by authentic, real language. We are not going to use language or to communicate by the language that we find in books. Okay, we need to understand how people or what kind of language, what kind of expressions, what kind of forms, what kind of how they pronounce sounds when they talk to each other. Okay, this is the authentic language that we are after. Show a preference for qualitative rather than quantitative modes of assessment. So we are after assessing the type or the kind of language, the kind of tests that help us to identify the quality of the language that our learners use and not how much. Okay, so we are not after how much vocabulary or how much sentences, how much structures, how many structures, how many words that our students they learn. No, we are after how our students can use the knowledge that they have about language in communicating with each other or with people outside the classroom. So what are the forms or the formats of the test that are nowadays adopted in the communicative approach of testing? Oral interview, essay writing, comprehension questions on an authentic passage. Okay, so we are not going to take any passage and make a test on reading comprehension. We are going to take a real passage. For instance, we can take an interview from TV, okay, and make the students read it, and we ask reading comprehension about it, or an article from a newspaper or a magazine, and make the students read it, and we ask reading comprehension questions about it. Reading an article and reacting to it, or listening to a lecture and reacting to it. And we know that a lecture is a real situation. When you make your students listen to a lecture, for instance, in linguistics, and then you ask them things about that they understood, what they understand from this lecture. This is a communicative test, because you are making your student listen to a real kind of text. What else? The communicative test should be interactive. Okay, as we said, not each student is doing or taking the test by himself or herself only. So they most of the time they rejected what the paper and pencil traditional forms of testing. Nowadays, throughout the performance test, they like to make students work in groups. To have the test, and the teachers are observing them and watching them and assessing their performance. It should be direct in nature, with tasks reflecting realistic discourse processing activities. Text and task should be relevant to the intended situation. Okay, ability should be sampled within meaningful and developing context. You see, again and again, we are focusing on this, using language, whether in teaching and testing in what, in meaningful and contextual situations. The test should be based on a priori specification. So what is to be tested and how it is to be tested should be laid down at the test design stage. So your students should be already familiar with the forms of the test that they are going to have, with the kind of instructions that they are going to listen or to hear from you as a teacher. They should be already familiar with how they are going to do this test in order to pass it. Okay, so you should all explain all these things before in direct language and simple language, in order to make the test easy to be understood and performed by your students. So with this, we have finished talking about the main approaches that were used and are nowadays used in language testing, depending on the approaches that were followed or nowadays followed in language teaching. Thank you.